Welcome to this L Monitor Pro webinar on the impact of the U.S. congressional elections this week on U.S. policy in the Middle East. I'm Andrew Parasoliti, President of L Monitor, and our panelists today include my L Monitor colleagues, Elizabeth Hagedorn, L Monitor State Department correspondent, Jared Suba, L Monitor Pentagon correspondent, and Adam Lucente, L Monitor correspondent covering regional, business, economic, and political issues. Before we get into the questions, a quick update on where the tally stands with regard to Tuesday's elections. In the House of Representatives, it looks like the Republicans are poised to take over. 33 votes are still being counted. The Republicans have gained 8 seats as we go live here and lead 210 to 192 over the Democrats. 218 is required for a majority. It appears likely the Republicans will take the House of Representatives. The Senate picture is even more complicated and cloudy. Right now, Republicans lead the tally 49 to 48. The Republican candidate in Nevada is ahead, Adam Laxalt. If he wins, it will be 50-48, and in Arizona, the Democrat Mark Kelly is ahead, and if he wins, it will be 50-49, and we will be back to where we were in 2020 with a runoff in Georgia on December 6th, deciding the fate of the Senate. That's a contest between Democrat Ralph Warnock and Republican Herschel Walker. What does this all mean for the Middle East if Republicans take the House as is expected and maybe even take the Senate? Let's start with Elizabeth Hagedorn. Elizabeth, what can we expect from the Congress regarding U.S.-Saudi relations? There's a lot of ill will over the OPEC Plus decision to cut production by 2 million barrels per day, and that started this month. And in addition to lingering concerns in the Congress, especially among Democrats, over human rights in the kingdom.
You're right, Andrew, and thanks for the question. I expect we'll see lawmakers start to put pressure on Biden to make good on that pledge to impose consequences on Saudi Arabia that he said were coming after midterms in response to those steep oil production cuts you referenced. The White House, it hasn't indicated how it will respond, but it's so far engaged in private conversations with members of Congress, plenty of whom have their own ideas about what that response should look like. Among Democrats, many of whom saw the OPEC decision as an effort by Saudi Arabia to meddle in the midterms, you've seen a range of legislation put forward, everything from bills that would cut off arms sales to the kingdom or immediately withdraw the U.S. troops stationed there. I think it's significant that Bob Menendez, if he remains Senate Foreign Relations Chair, has said he'll use that position to roll back cooperation with Riyadh. Of course, without Republican support, passing a lot of this sort of punitive action becomes much more difficult. And what we've seen from Republicans is less a call for retaliation and more so a push for Biden to boost domestic energy production. I should mention the legislation that does have bipartisan support and is being considered by Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer is the so-called NOPEC bill, which would allow the United States to sue Saudi Arabia and other OPEC members for antitrust violations and market manipulation. But you mentioned human rights. I think this sort of recalibration of the Riyadh relationship has certainly thrust its troublesome rights record back into the spotlight 4 years after the Khashoggi killing really did provide a moment of rare bipartisan backlash to Saudi Arabia in Congress. As we've reported, of concern today is Saudi Arabia's continued detention of several U.S. citizens and residents held in the kingdom who appear to be part of what's seen as a broader clampdown on dissenting voices. But Biden has received a lot of blowback from his own party after returning from Jeddah this July without any apparent gains on human rights. And I think in a sign of tensions in the relationship, it should come as no surprise that Biden, they say, has no plans to meet with Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, much less give him a fist bump next week at the G20 summit. Andrew, I think you're on mute.
I am on mute. A reminder for those who would like to submit questions, please do so via your Q&A function on your Zoom screen. Jared, you're at the Pentagon every day. What are you picking up on the defense side regarding potential shifts in the U.S.-Saudi relationship? Do you see any impact of the congressional elections on U.S.-Saudi security ties in the Gulf and arms sales to the kingdom?
Hi, Andrew. Yes, I think potentially, yes, we could see a bit of a shift. It's worth noting that the majority of flack that the Biden administration has gotten on its relationship with Saudi Arabia, or its approach to the U.S. relationship with Saudi Arabia, has come from the president's own party, as has obviously been mentioned. For example, if the House flips, I mean, what you might see, what you're likely to see, is an end to progressive Democrats' push. This push that was led by Congressman Ro Khanna to reroute Patriot air defense missiles from Saudi Arabia, which have been earmarked for Saudi Arabia, to send to Ukraine. That's unlikely to happen if the Republicans take control of the House. Ranking member of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, Michael McCall, has been a strong supporter of U.S. arms sales to Saudi Arabia, with a close eye to competition with China in the region. He supports the Abraham Accords expansion. So on those areas, you do see, Republican support for the Biden administration's position. Now, the administration has said that they will be reevaluating the relationship with Saudi Arabia after the OPEC Plus decision to slash oil production by 2 billion barrels per day. There's been no sign of that so far. The administration has not said they would be interested in curtailing arms sales. The pressure on that has been coming from largely from Democrats on the Hill. So one potential ally the Biden administration might find as they continue to sort of fence off or try to keep the damage from this OPEC dispute only skin deep is Congressman Todd Young, who's on the subcommittee, the Middle East subcommittee and House Foreign Affairs. He has a long history of bipartisanship on these issues. He's worked with in the past on opposition to Biden's support, or the U.S. support for the war in Yemen, and you're likely to see continued evolution in support for the Biden administration's position on support for the Saudis' defensive efforts to prevent ballistic missile and drone attacks into the kingdom.
Republican House will probably be welcomed by Benjamin Netanyahu, assuming he is able to assemble a government in Israel, as is expected. How do you see the development of a Republican House of Representatives, maybe even a Republican Senate, affecting U.S.-Israel relations if Netanyahu is back in office as prime minister?
Thanks, Andrew. Yeah, I think Prime Minister-elect Netanyahu probably wanted a so-called red wave and a strong Republican victory, and that's not exactly what happened. But I anticipate that, assuming Netanyahu becomes prime minister and Republicans take the House, I think it'll be kind of like the Obama years, when Netanyahu's relations with the president were somewhat cool, but he had many allies in Congress. Of course, U.S. support to Israel still continued during that time. Netanyahu was accused of supporting Mitt Romney in the 2012 election when he tried to defeat Obama. And then, of course, Netanyahu gave a controversial speech in 2015 to Congress where he criticized the Iran deal. So I think you could see both those issues cause tension. So I think that could happen again. But overall, I don't really expect any big changes in U.S.-Israel ties from this election. Whether the Senate maintains as a slight Democratic majority or the Republicans take it, remember that Israel is less of a partisan issue there. There's plenty of Democrats like Menendez, Schumer, and Cardin who ensure that Israel has support on both sides. Another thing, last thing about the House is that the big critics of Israel in the House were reelected, namely Rashida Tlaib and Ilhan Omar. And they've tried to advance some more pro-Palestinian legislation in the current Congress, but that hasn't really worked out and transferred into law, and that will still be the case in this new Congress.
Thank you. For those of you, again, who would like to submit questions, and we've got a number of them already in the queue, please do so via the Q&A function on your Zoom screen. Elizabeth, we have a question about the Iran nuclear talks. That has, until recently, been a signature objective of the Biden administration. Has it gotten harder or easier for Biden to proceed with the nuclear talks now that he's going to have probably at least the House of Representatives as a Republican House, and maybe even the Senate? That remains to be seen, of course.
Well, I think even a split Congress will bring greater oversight of Biden's Iran policy and certainly complicate those efforts to resurrect a nuclear agreement. I should say, despite their midterm games, the Republicans are still pretty powerless to block actual implementation of the deal if one is reached, which is still a big if, and we can talk about that. But I think, what they will do is try to make use of the 2015 law that mandates a congressional review for any new nuclear accord, and forcing a vote on the deal would really sort of highlight the lack of political consensus at the time when Biden would be trying to sell it to the American public. So if nothing else, JCPOA opponents in Congress could provide a headache for this administration. But as you referred to, the JCPOA isn't exactly on the agenda right now. As Rob Malley himself has said, the focus really is on supporting the protesters and holding Iran accountable for its continued crackdown. But Biden and Iran hawks in Congress do disagree on how best to do that. Some Republicans want the administration to expand the current campaign of sanctions. A good place to start, they say, is at the highest levels of the Iranian regime. Hit President Raisi, who is already under sanctions, but designate him with human rights abuses or for human rights abuses. So that's one approach. In addition, there are calls for the administration to keep expanding its targeting of Iran's illegal oil exports, to designate more local commanders for their role in the crackdown, and also blacklist the family members of regime officials wanting to travel to the US. So those are just a few examples of where Republicans want to take this. And some of the staffers I've spoken with have hinted at a range of congressional related legislation, sanctions related legislation that they plan to roll out in the coming weeks and months, for which I think there will be a degree of bipartisan support as the regime continues this ruthless repression of its own people.
Jared, do you see any change in the U.S.-Israel security relationship with a likely Republican House of Representatives? How do you see that relationship proceeding? It's always been pretty solid on the security side. Do you expect any changes?
I don't expect any changes. Again, if anything, I think you'll see more support for the administration's approach to security, not only with Israel, but with the region, the broader region in general. You saw that there is broad bipartisan support, of course, for the expansion of the Abraham Accords. You saw earlier this year a measure put forth by Senator Joni Ernst pushing for additional progress on what CENTCOM has been doing sort of behind closed doors in the region with regional militaries, expanding integrated air and missile defense to sort of build a defensive bulwark against Iran's arsenal of missiles and drones. So I foresee, if anything, increased support for the administration's efforts, which again have not been affected in any serious way by the OPEC dispute. I think arguably more consequential for the Biden administration's approach to security, Israel's security and regional security, are the elections in Israel. It's obviously no secret that the administration didn't necessarily prefer a return of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and his government, particularly in this form. And of course, during the Obama administration, there was some tension between U.S. officials and the Netanyahu government over how to approach Iran. They were obviously, the Israeli government at the time was obviously totally opposed to the JCPOA. And of course, there were, as has been well reported, these sorts of private threats or private warnings that from the Israeli side that they would not hesitate to act unilaterally militarily against Iran if they should need to do so to neutralize a potential Iranian nuclear progress. That's something that should be taken very seriously. Benny Gantz, Israeli defense minister, has spoken about this just in the past week. That he expects Benjamin Netanyahu's government to act responsibly about this. And of course, this is something that officials in the Pentagon take very seriously as well. Dialogue continues with the Israelis between US officials and the Pentagon, of course, has long been in communication with the Israelis about their airstrikes in the region against Iran-backed militias in Syria, for example, urging them at times to sort of scale back the attacks or be careful not to strike Iranian targets in Syria at times that could potentially cause backsplash or militia attacks on U.S. Forces in Syria. And as we just saw that these strikes the other night, these are ongoing and something Pentagon officials keep a close eye on.
Adam, two of the winners in the election are John Fetterman, Democrat, who will now be the senator from Pennsylvania, and J.D. Vance, who Republican senator from Ohio. What do we know about their foreign policy views and anything of note specifically in their backgrounds on the Middle East?
We know a few things. So I'll start with J.D. Vance. He is pro-Israel. He interestingly visited Tel Aviv in July, and he did an interview with the Jerusalem Post there. And he said he would be in the Senate, and he endorsed Trump's decision to move the U.S. embassy to Jerusalem from Tel Aviv. He also talked about the Iran deal, and he's called it a disaster to the Jerusalem Post. And he's also made similar statements on his Twitter, just completely criticizing the Iran deal. So I think it's clear where he'll stand if that comes back up in the Senate. He's also big on energy independence. And this is interesting because of the U.S. relations with Saudi Arabia. Vance criticized President Biden for asking Saudi Arabia to boost oil production. And this is because Vance supports more domestic oil production in the U.S. And he criticized Biden for selling the U.S.'s strategic petroleum reserves. So I could see Vance joining efforts by some of the Senate, like Ted Cruz, who have recently tried to limit these sales. But of course, these sales are relatively small compared to OPEC, and they won't have much effect on the Middle East. But overall, he has very Trumpian foreign policy views. He talks about America first. But interestingly, J.D. Vance started as a never Trumper. He didn't like President Trump. So it'll be interesting to see if he switches his tune again now that he is not facing election for 6 years. And John Fetterman, he was notably endorsed by Democratic Majority for Israel. On the Iran deal, though, he's said that he supported it. He gave an interview to Jewish Insider recently where he said Trump made a mistake leaving the Iran deal. And he said he supports Biden's negotiations. But Fetterman has made it clear he's against, of course, Iran obtaining a nuclear weapon. Interestingly, Fetterman was endorsed by Peace Action, which is an anti-war left-wing group, and they support boycotts against Israel. And he accepted the endorsement, but I don't think he's really in line with their views. It would have been also interesting had his opponent, Dr. Oz, won the election because he would have been the first Muslim senator. And he's, of course, a Turkish citizen with still ties to the country, but that did not happen. And it'll also be interesting to see who wins the Georgia runoff between Herschel Walker and Raphael Warnock. There's not a lot of difference between them, but Warnock earlier in his career had more pro-Palestine views. So we'll see what happens there.
We have a couple of questions asking about whether the increased friction in the U.S.-Saudi relationship could drive the kingdom closer to Russia and China. Is that not a concern for U.S. policy? Elizabeth, do you want to take that one?
Sure. I think there was an accusation, certainly, that these cuts led by Saudi Arabia were of benefit to Russia, will help Russia fund its war in Ukraine by driving up oil revenues. And there is an argument to be made that cutting off weapons sales to Saudi Arabia, as many Democrats are calling for, might not be the wisest decision, as it could allow China and other actors to sort of fill that gap. I might defer to Jared on this one as far as what other options Saudi Arabia has on arms sales, if that's all right.
Thank you, Jared.
Sure. Yeah. No. This is a major concern within the Pentagon. But as the administration has made clear, they're not going to tamper with, at this time at least, the security commitment to the Saudis. The Pentagon, of course, is a very strong proponent of continuing providing the Saudis with the arms that they need to defend themselves and to maintain a functioning, military force. I think it's worth noting that, the administration doesn't want this OPEC dispute to go anywhere near the security relationship. The Saudis do have options in purchasing hardware. They've already purchased, Chinese drones in the past. It's unlikely that, for example, the Russians could make inroads by selling the Saudis aircraft. Given the enormous array that the Saudis already have of radar systems and other equipment that they have sourced from the Americans, which wouldn't be compatible with Russian hardware. The Egyptians, of course, found that out the hard way in recent years. That said, it would really complicate the U.S. relationship, and it would just be another factor driving Washington and Riyadh apart. So that is something that the administration takes seriously.
Adam, there's a question here that if a Prime Minister Netanyahu allows some of the Israeli far-right parties to take key positions in the government and perhaps provocative actions in the West Bank or the Temple Mount in return for their support in forming a government, how might the Biden administration respond to this? We've already had reports that there are concerns from the Biden administration about some of the people who may be considered for serious positions within a Netanyahu administration.
Yeah, so a lot of this depends on what actually happens on the Israeli side. A lot of the concern is over a guy named Itamar Ben-Gvir. He's a far-right Jewish nationalist, and he's talked about expelling some Arabs from Israel in the past. He's been widely condemned and charged with inciting racism. He wants the security portfolio. So it'll be interesting to see what happens there. There's been reports that the Biden administration will not deal with him, but he won't be likely foreign minister. So I'm not sure how they would deal with him anyway. But it seems that they definitely don't want him, specifically Itamar Ben-Gvir, in the government. Recently in Israeli press, Ben-Gvir has said that he's moderated. So he might try to tone down his rhetoric, and that might make the Biden administration less nervous about dealing with him. But in terms of what Biden specifically would do, I think I'll defer to Elizabeth on that one.
Sure. I mean, I think publicly what the State Department and the White House are saying right now is it's too early to speculate. I think the line is we won't engage in hypotheticals while waiting for this government formation process to play out. But as our own Ben Caspit has written about, behind the scenes, U.S. officials are gearing up for, a confrontational relationship with the very right-leaning government that Netanyahu plans to install. I think Ben reported that already, as Biden and Bibi had their, polite and warm appearing phone call this week, the U.S. ambassador to Israel was already working on setting up communications with the head of an ultra-Orthodox party in Israel that, while still very right-leaning and whose views definitely don't line up with this president in the U.S., is seen as more pragmatic. And I think the quote from an Israeli official is, he would be the responsible adult in the room. So that's sort of what might be happening behind the scenes right now as this government formation process plays out. One issue to watch as far as U.S. policy is concerned is what happens to this visa waiver program that Israel would like to enter. I think that is very much under threat, already was. And, you had members of Congress, all Democrats, writing to Blinken, urging him to refrain from adding Israel to the program. That was over its treatment of Palestinian Americans in the West Bank. That was before Netanyahu's election victory. And then the other issue I'm keeping an eye on is the future of the US consulate in Jerusalem, which was the sort of de facto embassy for the Palestinians before it was shuttered under the Trump administration. You'll recall that it was a campaign promise of Biden's to reopen it. That hasn't happened so far, perhaps as sort of a little gesture to Yair Lapid and Naftali Bennett before him. But, with Netanyahu as prime minister, I think kind of all bets are off. And it'll be interesting to see what happens to the future of the consulate.
Jared, do you see Iran's selling arms to Russia, including armed drones for use in the war in Ukraine, is a problem for Middle East countries, including Iraq?
A problem for Middle East countries? I'm not sure. I mean, they've already have in the past transferred drone components and other projectile weapon components through Iraq on their way to Syria. Obviously, this has been publicly discussed by both the U.S. government and regional governments as well. I think the demonstration that Iran is willing to provide these weapons to Russia, knowing what Russia has been doing in Ukraine, is sort of extensive war crimes and attacks against civilians, that's really concerning. It's known in the region what Iran is willing to do with these weapons. We've seen it most prominently with the 2019 Abqaiq and Khurais attack. But it certainly is a signal not only to the region, but to the West, as Elizabeth has reported, that Iran is willing to really put these weapons to use. Now, it does seem the Iranians, or at least the Iranian Foreign Ministry, has gotten some cold feet after the U.S. Has declassified and publicized quite a bit of the intel on this, something of an embarrassing episode it's turning into for the Iranians, especially with the movement at the UN. We'll see if they continue to do this. The U.S. officials have said that they suspect, or that they have concerns, I should say, that the Iranians are potentially going to send more of these drones to Russia. And of course, there are concerns in Washington as well that the Iranians may send ballistic missiles. What you're likely to see out of the U.S. is continued declassification of intelligence ahead of these potential movements in an effort to dissuade the Iranians from doing this. You saw Pentagon's policy chief late last week, touting this method of declassifying intelligence as one of the arrows in the quiver of U.S. deterrence with regards to Iran's recent threat to attack Saudi Arabia last week. That attack has not transpired. The U.S. got out ahead of that and publicized and spoke publicly on this without making too much noise. But you're likely to see more of that going forward.
Adam, do we expect to see any change in US Lebanon relations in the new Congress?
I probably wouldn't expect any changes to US Lebanon relations. One of the important things with Lebanon is a lot of pro-Israel Congress people are reluctant to give Lebanon any more aid because of Hezbollah's presence and active involvement in Lebanon. So I don't anticipate that changing at all. But you might see continued interest in trying to help Lebanon economically, including from the House Foreign Affairs Committee, even if McCall will become the chairman over Meeks. I do think there will still be continued interest in helping Lebanon economically, but I don't anticipate any big upgrade or downgrade in US-Lebanon relations.
Elizabeth, do you see any movement on the War Powers Act resolution with regard to the region? We've seen this initiative in the past by Senator Kaine of Virginia regarding U.S. engagement in Iraq and during the ISIS campaign with regard to Iraq, Afghanistan, and other issues. But there's also been talk that could be applied in with regard to Saudi Arabia or other Gulf security matters as well.
Yeah, I think after the OPEC backlash, we could see a sort of renewed effort in Congress to cut off what remains of US military support for Saudi Arabia in Yemen. You'll recall that shortly after coming into office, Biden cut off support for the coalition's offensive operations, but questions remained over what exactly offensive support constituted. And so there is a bipartisan bill in the House with, I think, more than 100 co-sponsors and companion legislation in the Senate that would invoke constitutional war powers to, among other things, end U.S. intelligence sharing for the purpose of enabling those strikes in Yemen. Previous efforts, have failed or were vetoed by President Trump, but I think some members are probably hopeful that this decision to cut oil production and the backlash that ensued could be a tipping point. Of course, I should mention from the administration's perspective, the main hurdle right now to ending the bloodshed in Yemen is not the Saudis, but the Iran-backed Houthi rebels who their last-minute demands in early October resulted in the collapse of a truce that had for 6 months brought relative calm to Yemen. So getting the warring parties back to the negotiating table, or at least getting the Houthis to make some compromises is definitely going to be a priority of this administration in the coming year.
We're just about out of time, but we have a question on the US-Egypt relationship. Do we see any changes as a result of Republicans in Congress? Elizabeth, I'll just come back to you because you wrote about this and in the takeaway and the tension in US-Egypt relations between a strong security and counterterrorism partner and continued concerns about human rights in Egypt. Does the change and likely change in the Congress affect that dynamic at all?
I don't think so. I mean, Republicans, I think, it says everything that there were no Republican co-signers to a letter that went out to President Biden that we reported on at Al Monitor last week, urging him to raise human rights concerns in his meeting with Sisi on Friday. To me, the story is more about the tensions between Biden and his own party on the US-Egypt relationship.
And Jared, anything to add on the Pentagon aspect of the US-Egypt relationship?
No, not so much. I mean, I think the stance is similar, where the administration is keen to continue security support. I will just add, though, on the previous question, it's worth noting that, as Elizabeth mentioned, this effort to cut off what remains of U.S. support for Saudi military support for Saudi Arabia. It's worth noting that the administration has said they are not giving intelligence to the Saudis for strikes within Yemen. That's come from CENTCOM, the previous CENTCOM commander. That said, there is a bit of a gray area in between what defines offensive and defensive support. You saw this with Senator Rand Paul's joint resolution to sort of end this, but to block this sale of air-to-air missiles for Saudi Arabia. And it's worth noting, I think, that as I mentioned previously, Senator Todd Young, who has been a longtime critic of U.S. support for the Saudi war effort. His stance has changed, as Elizabeth mentioned, as the threat has evolved from the Saudi campaign to the Iran-backed Houthis and their campaign of ballistic missile attacks into Riyadh. And so I think what you're likely to see, for example, Senator Young did not support Rand Paul's resolution to block the AMRAAM sale. So I think you're actually likely to see, if the administration does go out on a limb and sell these sort of gray area offensive, defensive weapons, air-to-air missiles can be used for other things besides shooting down incoming drones. I think you're going to see with a greater Republican control of the Senate, for example, I think you're going to see greater support for leeway for the Biden administration to sort of arm the Saudis in ways that are arguably defensive.
And Adam, just quickly, last word, because the COP27 climate summit is taking place in Egypt. This is a major international event. US climate envoy John Kerry is there. It's a priority for the Biden administration to work on climate issues, and Egypt is a center stage right now regarding climate. What are you seeing? I know you've been covering the COP27 for us. How do you see that as a piece of the US-Egypt relationship?
Yeah, so there has been some like chatter from people who are critical of all the kind of climate attention Egypt is getting because of the human rights issues in the country. But I think that's overshadowed by Egypt's kind of important role in the climate transition. There's a lot of deals being made at COP27, and there's particularly a big focus on green hydrogen, which is something we don't hear about a lot in the US, but it is something that Egypt and the Gulf states are interested in. And Egypt is just going to continue to be important in terms of the energy transition because they're in the Middle East and they're close to the Gulf, but they don't have much like hydrocarbon themselves. And they're also a gas partner of Israel. Israel exports them gas. So Egypt's going to continue to be important there. And I think that will overshadow the human rights concerns about Egypt vis-a-vis their important place in the energy transition.
We have run out of time. I'd like to thank our panelists, my colleagues at Al Monitor, Elizabeth Hagedorn, Jared Suba, Adam Lucente. Thank you for your comments, analysis, and your many contributions to Al Monitor. To our viewers, thank you for participating. Thanks for the great questions. I'm sorry we didn't get to all of them. You can follow all of the news and trends at lmonitor.com and check out our Al Monitor Pro premium offer. That's available as well. This session and many more to come are part of what we're doing at Al Monitor Pro, and we look forward to engaging you on all of the challenges and issues facing the Middle East.